It was a perfect, serene afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun dipped low, casting golden hues on the rows of meticulously kept lawns. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, while birds fluttered among the trees. It was a place where life moved at a steady, predictable pace, until, without warning, the unmistakable hum of a powerful engine broke the calm. From behind the tree-lined street, the sleek, glimmering shape of a Rolls-Royce emerged, its polished chrome gleaming like a jewel in the sunlight. The luxury vehicle coasted down the road with effortless grace, its engine a symphony of wealth and power. People paused, momentarily stunned by the unfamiliar sight. It wasn't just the car that made heads turn. It was the statement it seemed to make, an unspoken challenge to the status quo of this peaceful suburban haven. The car slid smoothly into the driveway of the modest home at the end of the block. The house wasn't particularly special, just another neatly trimmed lawn, a few flowers in bloom, and a white picket fence that screamed perfectly normal. But this car, this shining beacon of luxury and excess, felt utterly out of place here. Standing across the street, Karen, the self-appointed president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, squinted her eyes, her lips curling into an unmistakable sneer. The pristine Rolls-Royce parked in the driveway wasn't just an eyesore to her. It was a provocation. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years and prided herself on maintaining its charm. To her, the arrival of such an ostentatious symbol of wealth was an affront to everything she had worked so hard to preserve. As she took another long, deliberate look at the car, she felt a surge of disdain. The gleaming chrome of the Rolls-Royce felt like a slap in the face, a statement from someone who didn't understand the values of this neighborhood. Who was this newcomer, and what gave them the right to flaunt such wealth? Karen's mind whirred. This was not going to stand. She could already feel the storm brewing inside her, a mix of anger and self-righteous indignation. How dare someone think they could waltz in here with their flashy car, thinking they could be above the rules? The HOA had always kept things simple. Conformity was key. Luxury was not the point. She, of all people, was going to make sure the rules were enforced. Call it what you want, she muttered to herself, her voice low and dangerous. But this isn't how we do things around here. Karen had been HOA president for years. Her word was law, her opinions unchallenged. Everyone knew her. Everyone feared her. The thought of someone breaking the unspoken code of the neighborhood by bringing such a flashy car into the fold gnawed at her. She needed answers. But she wasn't the only one who noticed the Rolls-Royce. Through the windows of nearby homes, other eyes were watching, curious, intrigued, some whispering. Whispers that would soon turn into questions, accusations, and in Karen's mind, a very necessary mission. The perfect, calm suburb was about to be shaken, and Karen, feeling a sense of both duty and control, already knew how this story was going to unfold. The sun had barely begun to dip below the horizon when the doorbell rang. The protagonist, still savoring the rush of excitement from their new purchase, was just about to settle in for the evening when they heard the sharp, insistent chime. Standing on the doorstep was none other than Karen, her ever-present clipboard clutched tightly in her hand. Her expression was a mix of fox politeness and simmering displeasure. The air between them instantly grew thick with tension. "Good evening," Karen said, her voice dripping with sweetness that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. "I trust you're settling in well." "Thank you, yes," the protagonist replied, trying to keep the conversation casual, not yet understanding the storm that was about to hit. Karen's gaze flicked over the Rolls-Royce, which stood like an immovable symbol of opulence in the driveway. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as she visibly fought to maintain composure. "You've got quite a vehicle there," Karen remarked, her tone neutral but sharp, like a blade sheathed in velvet. "I didn't realize this neighborhood had taken a turn towards such flamboyance." The protagonist glanced over at the car, confused. It was just a car, after all. It wasn't hurting anyone. But Karen, who had made it her mission to preserve the community's atmosphere, clearly saw it as an affront to everything she held dear. "It's a Rolls-Royce," Karen continued, her eyes scanning the vehicle with distaste. "And while I'm sure you think it's charming, it doesn't exactly fit with the spirit of this neighborhood. You see, we have a very specific standard here, an unspoken one, but it's understood by all." A cold shiver ran down the protagonist's spine. Unspoken standards. What was she talking about? Before they could respond, Karen's tone hardened, her voice now carrying the weight of authority. "I'll have to report this," she said, her words coming out in a clipped, almost triumphant manner. "The HOA is about consistency. We don't allow such distractions. I'll make sure this doesn't become a pattern." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. Report this? To who? They were suddenly aware of the power Karen held over the neighborhood, and the unease in the pit of their stomach grew. "I don't see the harm in it," the protagonist said carefully, hoping to diffuse the tension. "It's just a car. And there aren't any rules against it, right?" Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red, and her hand clenched tighter around her clipboard. "Rules," she scoffed. "Rules are one thing, but the spirit of this community is another. You can't just show up here with your showy car and expect everyone to be okay with it. You're making the rest of us look bad." There it was, the unspoken accusation that hung in the air, thick as smoke. Karen wasn't just offended by the car. She was offended by the idea that someone else could break the mold, outshine her, and live by a different set of standards. Before the protagonist could protest, Karen took a step back, her eyes never leaving the Rolls-Royce. She stared at it for a long moment, almost as if trying to will it to disappear. "I'll be in touch," she said flatly, turning on her heel. "Don't think I won't make a note of this for the next HOA meeting. This isn't over." With one last look of contempt, Karen walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The protagonist watched her go, a growing sense of dread gnawing at their insides. What had they gotten themselves into? As Karen disappeared around the corner, the protagonist stood frozen on the doorstep, a feeling of unease tightening around their chest. The peaceful suburb they had envisioned now seemed like a battlefield, and Karen, armed with her clipboard, was clearly ready for war. What had started as a simple purchase, a dream come true, had quickly spiraled into a nightmare. Would this be the first of many confrontations? The suspense lingered in the air, thick and palpable, as the quiet neighborhood began to buzz with whispers, and the stakes grew higher with every passing moment. The next morning, the tension was palpable in the air. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, but already the protagonist could sense something wasn't right. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a peaceful haven, now seemed to be on edge. Whispers spread like wildfire. It started with a few curious glances at the Rolls-Royce, but soon, those glances turned into cautious stares. Something about that car had stirred the pot, and it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Just as the protagonist was getting ready to head out, the familiar, sharp sound of a knock on the door echoed through the house. It was too early for this. Opening the door, the protagonist was greeted not just by Karen, but by two uniformed police officers, their presence casting a shadow over the front step. The officers' expressions were neutral, their eyes scanning the surroundings, but it was the tension in the air that spoke louder than anything. They weren't here for a casual conversation. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you the owner of this Rolls-Royce?" one of the officers asked, his voice polite but firm. The protagonist blinked, stunned. "Yes, I am. Is there a problem?" Karen stepped forward, a tight, knowing smile on her face, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and satisfaction. "I believe there is," she said, her tone dripping with Fox concern. "I just called the police about a very serious issue. This car doesn't belong here." The officers exchanged a brief glance, then turned their attention back to the protagonist. "Karen here claims that this vehicle was seen driving through the neighborhood at odd hours of the night," the other officer said, his voice colder now. and she suspects it was stolen. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Stolen. The word echoed in the protagonist's mind, disbelief mixing with growing anger. What was Karen trying to do? I'm not sure what Karen is referring to, the protagonist said, trying to stay calm, but the accusation stung. This is my car, and it's parked here legally. There's no reason for any concern. Karen cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. It's not just the car, she insisted, her eyes narrowing. It's the whole situation. The car appears to be out of place. This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood. People don't just show up with something like this and expect to fit in. The officers exchanged another look, and for a brief moment, the protagonist thought they might be on their side. But then, the second officer stepped forward, his voice more guarded. We'll need to run the vehicle's registration, ma'am, he said, his words thick with protocol. We take theft accusations seriously. We'll need to check everything. The protagonist's heart sank. They had nothing to hide, but the situation was spiraling fast. How could Karen have twisted things so quickly? What was her game? Was she really going to push this so far? The officers started asking for the registration, and as they took down the details, Karen stood to the side, her arms crossed, watching the entire exchange with a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. The protagonist couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze, as if she was silently waiting for the inevitable victory she had convinced herself was coming. For the next few minutes, the world outside seemed to close in. The once peaceful street, with its neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences, now felt like a cold, hostile place. Neighbors peeked through their windows, watching as the police officers rummaged through the paperwork, whispering behind drawn curtains. What had been a dream? This car, this new life, was turning into a nightmare. Finally, one of the officers spoke, his voice breaking the thick silence. We've verified the vehicle's registration. It checks out. It's registered to you. The protagonist exhaled, but Karen wasn't done yet. She pressed forward, her voice sharp, accusing, like a woman with an agenda. But how can we be sure it wasn't stolen and brought here by someone else? It's too new, too expensive for someone in this neighborhood. The officers, clearly uncomfortable with her persistence, gave a brief nod before turning to the protagonist. We'll be in touch, one said curtly, and they walked back to their car, the wheels of bureaucracy slowly grinding into motion. Karen lingered for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the protagonist. I'm watching you, she spat, before turning on her heel and stalking off down the sidewalk, her heels clicking menacingly on the pavement. The door closed behind the protagonist, and a cold wave of realization swept over them. What was Karen's next move? And how far would she go to destroy their life over something as trivial as a car? The sense of dread was palpable now, as the quiet neighborhood they once knew so well began to transform into a battleground. And in this war, it was clear, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. The days following the police visit were nothing short of excruciating. The protagonist went about their daily routine, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers that followed them like a shadow. Neighbors who once offered warm smiles now turned their faces away. Even the local grocery store clerk seemed to take a little longer to scan their items, her eyes darting nervously. The worst part, however, was the upcoming HOA meeting. Karen had made sure that the wheels of community action were turning swiftly. So swiftly, in fact, that by the time the meeting arrived, everyone in the neighborhood was talking about the Rolls-Royce and the supposed criminal who had brought it here. The protagonist entered the HOA meeting that evening with a sense of dread gnawing at their gut. The usual politeness and small talk of these gatherings had been replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion. Karen had already poisoned the well, and the community was beginning to buy into her narrative. As the meeting began, Karen stood at the front with her arms folded, a smug smile playing at the corners of her lips. She was ready for her moment. I'm glad you all could make it tonight, she started, her voice syrupy sweet, but the venom behind it was unmistakable. We have a very important issue to discuss, one that affects the reputation of our lovely neighborhood. She turned her gaze toward the protagonist, the look in her eyes icy and calculated. As you all know, a new resident has moved into our community. They'd brought with them a luxury vehicle, a Rolls-Royce, one that not only doesn't fit the aesthetic of this neighborhood, but, as I discovered, has questionable origins. Gasps rippled through the room as Karen's words stank in. Murmurs filled the air, and the protagonist could feel the weight of dozens of eyes now locked onto them. The chill in the room was suffocating, and they could feel the growing unease as Karen continued. "I called the police," she said, her voice filled with mock concern. "And while they did confirm that the car is registered to our new neighbor, they haven't been able to fully clear up the situation. Why would someone with so much money, so much luxury, come into a humble community like ours and flaunt it in our faces?" The words stung. Every accusation seemed to be aimed at the very heart of who the protagonist was. Their success, their choice to indulge in a dream, their very existence. The tension was unbearable. "But this isn't just about one car," Karen continued, fanning the flames of suspicion. "This is about the values we uphold here in our neighborhood. We pride ourselves on consistency and modesty. This car doesn't belong here. It's a statement of excess, and it undermines everything this community stands for." At that moment, the protagonist could almost feel the air thicken with Karen's power. Her words were carefully chosen to make the others question their judgment. Had they really thought this through? Was their decision to bring the Rolls-Royce here truly an affront to the community, as Karen claimed? The murmur of agreement spread across the room, some nodding along, others exchanging wary glances. The power of the HOA had always been rooted in conformity, and now Karen had expertly used that power to manipulate the room. The protagonist's voice trembled as they spoke up, trying to regain control. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I bought the car because I love it, because it was a dream come true. There's nothing wrong with having something nice. I'm not here to make anyone feel uncomfortable." But Karen was already ahead of them. "I'm not the only one who feels this way," she cut in, her voice rising now. "Several of our neighbors have expressed concern. They'd voiced their discomfort with the car and what it represents. We cannot allow a single individual to disrupt the harmony of our community." A few heads nodded, and it was clear Karen had succeeded. The subtle manipulation, the carefully planted seeds of doubt, had worked. The room was no longer filled with sympathy for the protagonist, but with judgment. They could feel it in the air, a collective, unspoken condemnation. And just as the meeting seemed to hit its peak, Karen made her move. "I propose that we issue a formal warning," she declared, her tone final. "We'll request that the vehicle be removed and that the homeowner adhere to the standards of our community. If not, we'll escalate this matter further." The room went silent. All eyes turned toward the protagonist, waiting for a response. Every breath seemed to hang in the balance. But Karen wasn't done yet. "If the vehicle isn't removed, I'll personally file an official complaint with the authorities. And trust me, once this community sees what they're really dealing with here, no one will be able to ignore it." The chill in the air grew colder, the walls of the room closing in as the protagonist realized the full weight of Karen's manipulation. She wasn't just targeting them. She was targeting everything they stood for. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest as the room held its breath, waiting for their next move. Would they back down, or would they stand their ground? The tension was unbearable, and with every passing second, Karen's victory seemed closer. But something in the protagonist snapped. They couldn't let Karen win. The night after the HOA meeting felt like a storm was brewing. The protagonist sat in their living room, the weight of the entire neighborhood pressing in from all directions. Karen had made her move, and the subtle tension of the previous days had exploded into something far more threatening. The HOA was on her side, and even the whispers in the streets seemed to be turning against them. The mere presence of the Rolls-Royce in the driveway had become an accusation in itself. But the protagonist wasn't going down without a fight. They couldn't. Their dream, This car, this life, wasn't something they were willing to let go of just because of one woman's obsession with control. Then, just as the darkness outside pressed against the windows like a suffocating force, there was a knock on the door. It was late, far later than anyone would normally stop by. The protagonist hesitated, wondering if it was another round of accusations or another visit from the police. But when they opened the door, they were shocked to see David, a neighbor they had hardly spoken to before. He was the quiet, reserved type, always kept to himself, never one for drama. But tonight, he looked different. His eyes were serious, his face set in a determined expression. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Confused but intrigued, the protagonist stepped aside, allowing him into the house. "What's going on, David?" they asked, trying to keep their voice steady despite the growing unease in their chest. David shut the door behind him and leaned against it, glancing nervously out the window before speaking. "I know what's going on here, and I'm not going to let it stand." The words hit like a shockwave. "What do you mean?" "I'm sure you've noticed by now. Karen's been stirring things up," David began, his voice low but urgent. "But what you don't know is that she's been doing this for years. Not just with you, but with everyone who doesn't fit her vision of what this neighborhood should be. She's been using the HOA as a weapon, and she's been pulling strings behind the scenes to control everyone." The protagonist's heart raced. Could it be true? David continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "I've seen it firsthand. She manipulates people, she controls what's said in meetings, and she uses her position to intimidate anyone who challenges her. I've been waiting for the right moment to step forward. But now you're her target." The tension in the room thickened. This was not the conversation the protagonist had expected. They had always seen David as just another quiet neighbor, but now they realized there was much more beneath the surface. "You're not the first person she's done this to," David said, his eyes hardening. "She's made a habit of crushing anyone who doesn't fit her narrow vision of the perfect neighborhood. But I'm not letting her do it to you. I have some sway in the community too, and it's time someone took a stand against her." The protagonist blinked, trying to process everything David had just said. They felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this around. "I'm not going to let her control me. I didn't do anything wrong. I follow the rules," the protagonist said, their voice rising with newfound confidence. "Why is she doing this? What does she want?" David shook his head. "It's not about the car. It's about control. Karen has a way of making people feel small, of making them believe they're wrong when they aren't. She wants people to stay in line, to stay in her little box of acceptable. The Rolls-Royce. It's a symbol. To her, it's an affront to everything she wants this neighborhood to represent. You're a threat to her authority, and that's why she's gone so far." The pieces were starting to fall into place. Karen wasn't just angry about a car. She was angry about the idea of someone challenging her power. And now the protagonist wasn't going to back down, not without a fight. "I won't let her win," the protagonist said firmly, the fire of determination lighting in their chest. "I'll fight this." David nodded, his face serious. "And I'll be right beside you. We'll show everyone the truth. Karen's not as invincible as she thinks." As David made his exit, leaving the protagonist with a newfound sense of resolve, the dark night outside didn't seem quite so oppressive anymore. They had an ally now, but the battle was far from over. With Karen's influence still looming large over the neighborhood, the next move would be crucial. But the protagonist felt ready now, more than ready. The game had changed. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. David's words lingered in their mind. This wasn't just about a car or a neighborhood dispute. It was about taking down someone who had woven a web of control and manipulation over the entire community. David's plan was simple yet daring. He had spent enough time in the neighborhood to know the weaknesses in Karen's armor. It was time to expose her for what she truly was, a manipulator hiding behind a mask of respectability. They would fight fire with fire, but it wouldn't just be a battle of words. It was going to be a full-blown war. The protagonist and David spent countless hours meeting in secret, devising their strategy. They needed to gather allies, people who had been silenced by Karen's influence. As the protagonist reached out to neighbors, it became clear Karen wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Several residents had been victims of her subtle, coercive tactics, but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, with David's backing, they saw an opportunity to turn the tide. The key to their plan was twofold. They would expose Karen's manipulations within the HOA, and they would undermine her credibility in front of the entire community. The plan involved discreetly collecting evidence, speaking to more neighbors, and most importantly, ensuring that the upcoming HOA meeting would be a showdown. As the date of the meeting drew nearer, tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. The Rolls-Royce continued to be a focal point, but now it wasn't just a symbol of excess. It had become a battle standard, a sign of resistance against Karen's authoritarian grip. Every glance, every whispered conversation seemed to carry more weight now. The neighborhood was holding its breath, and the protagonist was at the center of it all. But it wasn't just Karen's influence they had to contend with. The HOA had already rallied behind her, and with several of her staunch supporters in the room, the protagonist knew the stakes were incredibly high. This wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about how much control Karen could exert over the people around her. The night before the meeting, David called. His voice was tense, urgent. "I got some things for tomorrow," he said cryptically. "But we need to be prepared. Karen has a way of turning the tables at the last minute. Don't be surprised if she tries to pull something desperate." The protagonist swallowed hard, the weight of the upcoming battle settling over them like a thick fog. Tomorrow was the day. The next morning, the streets of the neighborhood felt quieter than usual. It was as if the entire community was holding its collective breath, waiting for the outcome of the upcoming meeting. The protagonist felt the pressure mounting with every passing minute. It was no longer just about defending their car. This was about defending themselves from someone who had made it her life's mission to tear others down for her own gain. When the time came for the meeting, the protagonist walked into the HOA office with a new sense of purpose. There was no turning back now. David was already there, a quiet nod of reassurance when their eyes met. It was clear that this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about everyone Karen had oppressed over the years. As the meeting began, Karen stood once again at the front, her usual air of superiority in full force. She smiled smugly, but there was a flicker of something different in her eyes. Maybe she knew what was coming, or maybe she was too sure of her control to even consider the possibility of defeat. Either way, the protagonist knew this would be the moment when everything would change. Before Karen could begin her usual tirade, David stood up, his voice calm but cutting. "I think it's time we hear from the rest of the neighborhood. Karen, you've had your say, but now it's time for others to speak out." The room went silent, every person in attendance suddenly on edge. It was a subtle challenge, but it was enough to shift the energy in the room. The undercurrent of rebellion was starting to build. David continued, his words carefully chosen but laced with intent. "There are things about this neighborhood that have been hidden for far too long. Things that Karen has been orchestrating behind the scenes. It's time the truth came to light." A murmur rippled through the room, the atmosphere suddenly charged with anticipation and fear. Karen's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she regained her composure. But it was too late. The first domino had been pushed. The protagonist stood, their voice steady but loud enough to be heard by everyone. "Karen's manipulation of this community has gone unchecked for too long. I'm not just here to defend my car. I'm here to defend my right to be a part of this neighborhood without fear of being torn apart by someone who thinks she can control us all." For the first time, Karen's eyes widened, and the room fell completely silent. The battle lines had been drawn. The tension in the room was palpable. It felt as if the air had thickened, every breath a struggle against the oppressive weight of the moment. The protagonists stood tall, the fire of defiance burning brightly in their chest. David stood beside them, unwavering, his eyes locked on Karen, who now looked less like the confident, manipulative leader of the HOA and more like a cornered animal. Karen's smile had slipped, revealing something colder beneath. She cleared her throat, straightening her posture in a futile attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're all jumping to conclusions based on what? Some wild accusations. My intentions here are pure. I've always worked hard to maintain the integrity of this community." But her words fell flat. The room was no longer buying it. For the first time, the protagonist could see the cracks in her facade, the mask of the benevolent, well-meaning neighbor slipping away. Karen had been the one to poison the well, but now, the truth was being unearthed, piece by piece, and it was more powerful than anything she could fabricate. "I think it's time we all take a closer look at Karen's version of integrity," David said, stepping forward with a cool, unwavering demeanor. "Let's talk about the way she's run this HOA for years. Let's talk about how she's used this very organization to manipulate people, push them out, and silence anyone who doesn't fit her perfect picture of this neighborhood." A murmur ran through the crowd as David's words landed, each one unraveling Karen's control, like the slow but inevitable tugging of a thread on a sweater. The room was beginning to shift, and the protagonist could feel the power of the moment, the sheer weight of the truth pulling people to their side. This wasn't just about the Rolls-Royce anymore. This was about the entire system Karen had built to control them. David wasn't done. "You think the problem is the car, Karen. No, the real problem is how you've turned this community into your own personal fiefdom, using the HOA as a weapon to target anyone you don't like. You've tried to tear down every person who didn't conform to your rigid idea of what this neighborhood should be." The silence in the room was deafening. The other members of the HOA, many of whom had once been loyal to Karen, exchanged uneasy glances. The tide was turning, but no one knew yet how far this would go. How far would Karen push before everything she'd built came crashing down? Karen's eyes narrowed, her face a mask of fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she spat, her voice cold and sharp. "This neighborhood was mine to protect, and I will protect it from people like you, people who think they can come in and change everything." It was clear now. Karen's desperation had begun to show. The cracks were widening, and her control was slipping from her fingers. The protagonist stepped forward, their voice firm and unwavering. "You've twisted the rules of this community for your own gain. You've hurt people, Karen. You've tried to destroy lives with your lies, your manipulation, and your fear tactics. But not anymore. This isn't your playground. This is a community, and it's time we started acting like one." David nodded, stepping aside so the protagonist could take the spotlight. The power had shifted. The momentum was on their side, and they could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that they were no longer just a target. They were the storm, the force that would shatter Karen's stranglehold on this neighborhood. Karen's face flushed with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think this will work?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I'll just let you walk all over me? I'll make sure this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of person you are. You're the problem here, not me." But her words no longer held the same power. The audience in the room was no longer hanging on her every word. Karen's manipulation had backfired. People were beginning to see her for what she really was, a tyrant hiding behind a facade of concern. In that moment, the protagonist realized something profound. The real battle wasn't over the Rolls-Royce. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about freeing the neighborhood from Karen's suffocating grip, a grip that had been slowly choking the life out of it for far too long. And just as Karen was about to unleash her next tirade, there was a sound at the door. The sheriff's deputy entered the room, his eyes scanning the tense crowd. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice authoritative yet calm. Karen froze. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the world had stopped spinning. The sheriff's deputy wasn't here to mediate. It was clear from the way he addressed the room. His presence was an interruption, a game changer. And for Karen, it was the beginning of the end. The sheriff's deputy's presence seemed almost surreal. For a moment, the entire room stood in stunned silence, unsure of what was happening. Karen's face was drained of color, her once confident stance now wavering. The power she had wielded so effortlessly over the neighborhood was slipping away, just like that. "Deputy, what are you doing here?" Karen's voice was sharp, but it cracked, betraying the fear rising beneath her icy exterior. The deputy surveyed the room, his eyes landing on Karen with a look that could melt stone. "I've been made aware of some serious complaints, Karen," he said calmly, his gaze unwavering. "There's been talk of manipulation, harassment, and abuse of power. We need to have a word." The room held its breath, the intensity of the moment building with every word that left his mouth. The neighbors, once fearful of Karen's wrath, were now looking at her with eyes wide open, seeing her for what she truly was, a bully who used her position to control them. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," Karen stammered, her voice losing the strength it once had. "I've been doing what's best for this community. I've protected it, kept it organized. You can't believe any of this nonsense." David stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "It's not nonsense, Karen. You've used your position to manipulate every person who didn't fit your ideal image of this neighborhood. You've used threats, you've spread lies, and you've made people afraid to stand up to you." The sheriff's deputy nodded, turning toward the protagonist. "We've been hearing complaints for a while. People have felt threatened, pushed out, and unable to voice their concerns because of Karen's actions. It's time to investigate what's been going on here." The tension in the room was electric, each person hanging on the deputy's every word. The community, once shackled by fear, was now on the cusp of freedom. The truth, finally brought into the light, was a force that couldn't be ignored. Karen's eyes darted around the room, trying to find a way out, but the walls were closing in. There was no escaping the truth anymore. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. Her carefully constructed image of the perfect HOA president, the one she had spent years building, was crumbling before her eyes. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice a whisper now, a shadow of the commanding tone she had once used. "You don't understand. This neighborhood is my domain." "No, Karen," the protagonist spoke up, their voice clear and resolute. "This neighborhood belongs to all of us. You've lost your control, and now it's time for all of us to have a voice." David turned to the crowd, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "It's time to rebuild this community. Together. No more manipulation. No more fear. We're done letting one person dictate how we live." A wave of agreement rippled through the room. People were standing up, speaking out, finding their courage. The protagonist, emboldened by the support around them, turned back to Karen, who was now visibly shrinking, her arrogance evaporating like smoke. The deputy nodded, his hand firmly resting on his radio. "Karen, I'm placing you under investigation. There are too many complaints, and I need to take you in for questioning. We'll be looking into your actions, and you'll have your day in court." The shock on Karen's face was almost satisfying. The queen of manipulation, the woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years, was now the one who was vulnerable. The power had shifted entirely. The sheriff's deputy gestured for Karen to step aside, but she didn't move. Her eyes were filled with desperation, her mask completely gone. For the first time, she looked like the very thing she had tried so hard to destroy. Weak. I don't deserve this," she mumbled, her voice quivering. But the words came too late. With a final glance around the room, Karen was escorted out, her once indomitable aura shattered. The crowd stood still, processing what had just happened. The protagonist stood at the center of it all, the Rolls-Royce outside still gleaming in the driveway, now a symbol of their victory, their resilience. As the door closed behind Karen, the room erupted into cheers. The community had been freed from her oppressive reign, and for the first time in years, there was hope. The protagonist's dream had not only been preserved, but the neighborhood was on the brink of becoming something better, something more unified. "Thank you," a voice from the crowd called out, and then another, until the room was filled with gratitude and newfound resolve. The sheriff's deputy turned to the protagonist. "You've done something incredible here. This neighborhood is better off for it." The protagonist nodded, their hearts swelling with pride. They had won, not just for themselves, but for the entire neighborhood. They had fought back against a tyrant, and they had come out on top. As the cheers continued to echo around the room, the protagonist glanced out the window at the Rolls-Royce, the car that had started it all. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and how much they had gained. The storm had passed, and the sun was finally shining on their neighborhood once again.